memory is one of the most important facets of any type of oral culture because it you weren't considered wise or ready to be a religious leader in the Jewish community unless you could remember large portions of the Old Testament. Very, very large portions, including the entire law, all five books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And the reason why they put such a high value on memory was because if some of these things were forgotten before they had the opportunity to write them down, or someone knew them that didn't have the ability to write them down or the materials, or even if they just didn't have access to the materials, because access to those materials were just very difficult and timely and expensive to get. And so many different methods were devised, including what is now commonly known as a memory palace. Now, memory palaces are important because if you're going to remember something, you have to properly categorize. You have to know, okay, this information I'm placing in this place, this information I'm placing in this place, like names, places, things. Those people that remember names really well associate a lot of different stuff with this name and to this person. Or maybe they even put an exaggerated image with the name and then associate it to the person. So, the way a memory palace works is you imagine like standing something similar to standing at the entrance to your house, and then you say, if you're learning a Bible story, associate the first part of the Bible story with that entrance. Such as with the Sermon on the Mount, the very opening is Jesus looked out at the crowds, and seeing them, he went up on the mountain. He called his 12 disciples close to him, and he began teaching, saying. Now, if you wanted to remember that using visualization such as memory palace, you would envision the front of your home or the beginning of a walk that you take regularly, or maybe even the first book on your bookshelf. And then you would associate that with an exaggerated image of a huge crowd of people. Like maybe you would imagine a baseball stadium all looking at the entrance to your house or the first book. And then 12 of them on the field looking at the door up to Jesus, who is on top of this huge mountain. The door is like this huge mountain. It sounds like a lot of work, but you can envision that instantaneously. And once you visualize that, as soon as you revisualize it, you'll remember all those details of that simple beginning to the Sermon of the Mount. And then you would say, go to your closet. Open up the door, go to your closet. And then you would do the same thing with the Beatitudes and then the salt and light and so on and so on and so on. The biggest key is exaggerated images. The more exaggerated or bizarre or weird or peculiar, the more your brain is going to latch onto it. And if you take the time to visualize it, which only takes a few seconds, you'll remember it. The difference is in a bit of an antidote, which says some people read to remember, and other people read to forget. But the more you do this, the more natural it becomes, and people have memorized the order of decks of playing cards in a minute using methods like this, where they use association and visualization. Because your brain is going to remember stuff associated to stuff you already know and remember. So, for example, if you're a fisherman, if I start talking to you about different lures and their uses, and I mention one new detail you're not familiar with, your brain is more likely to remember that than if I were to start talking about, say, shearing sheep, something you know absolutely nothing about. You would be so lost in the little things or the big details, you would miss all of the little details. And the same is true with stories. You need to associate it with stuff you already know. The same can be done with a line of just completely desperate concepts and words. So if you take your story and you do a word outline where you just say a word for this chunk, a word for this chunk, a word for this chunk. And so you've brought it down to single words that mean entire chunks. So like salt and light for part of the Sermon on the Mount, and then divorce for another part, and so on and so forth. If you can remember the rest of the story using just that word, then all you need to do is associate this word to that word, and then this word to this word, and then this word to this word, and then this word to this word. So if you can have a visualization of the first word that's exaggerated and big and preposterous, the more exaggerated the better for your memory. And then associate that to the next one, like say, if let me use an example from the Sermon on the Mount. If we're going to use, say, the Beatitudes, and the first one is, God blesses those who are poor and recognize their need for Him. The kingdom of heaven is theirs. Recognize a poor beggar, shabby, tattered clothes, with absolutely nothing on him. Maybe even visualize his pockets sticking out like there's no money, no possessions whatsoever that he has. And then picture that he's holding in his hand the kingdom of heaven, some kind of visualization of that, whether light or one of those images from Sunday school. And that simple visualization will help you remember that. And then you would envision that picture perhaps turning into someone that is just bawling their eyes out for someone who is mourning, and then God will comfort them. And so on and so forth. The more exaggerated, the more disparate the concepts, the better for your memory. For the salt and the light, I've used a picture, a visualization of the sun becoming a salt shaker, or the sun, and instead of light coming from the sun, salt pouring out of the sun. It seems preposterous, and that's why your memory latches onto it and remembers it better. And then when you tell it, you just can go back to that and picture it if you ever get lost or caught up in some obscure detail, or you get caught at one of the transitions. If you can go back to the last image and then imagine the next one, you can immediately find your place, and your memory will quickly become more reliable. Another concept of this is just beginning to trust your memory and beginning to trust the story. As the commonly quoted verse says, God's word will never return void. And this is one of those concepts that we have to realize, because Though we might not be comfortable relying on our memory with something as valuable to us as God's word, we need to trust that God will do his work through us to tell it accurately and tell it well. And there are other concepts of oral communities, of self-correctedness and self-correcting. When mistakes are made, especially in Bible stories, it's often in a setting where people will correct you. And this is a good thing because it gives the community a sense of ownership of these stories and the sense that they want them to be accurately retold because they want it in their hearts and in their minds and on their lips. One great example I've heard before is of a man teaching on Jonah, and he intentionally made a mistake while he was telling the story, and the whole community just immediately corrected him. And when he was finished, he went up to this next to his friend who he was teaching about telling Bible stories, and he said, "Well, that was really good, but next time you might want to learn it better." And then he looked at him and said, "Oh, no, I know the story." And now all of them know it better too. Well, good luck as you learn to tell stories, and I suggest you take a Bible story, any story you choose or one you've worked on throughout these videos, and chunk it, and then try to find visualizations for each of the scenes and connect them to each other, either through the storyline of walking through your house, or visualize the image turning into the other image in some way, or bizarrely associated in some way. And see how that helps your memory for you to remember these stories as you work to hide God's word in your heart.